Peter and Jude confirm this in the New Testament when they both mention it. The angels who sinned are in chains and gloomy darkness. And Peter is very specific. He says, for if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them down to hell, except the word in Greek is Tartarosis, which means Tartarus. That's not Hades, which is where the human dead presumably go. It's not Sheol in the Hebrew mind. Tartarus was a special place reserved for supernatural rebels. So it's a pretty good theory then that this Shemiyaza, because Peter and Jude are both clearly referring to the Genesis 6 incident, which is what's described in 1st Enoch. If Shemiyaza is in Tartarus with these sinful angels, you know, the Greeks in their theology, what we call mythology, believed that there were a group of old gods who were in the underworld, in Tartarus. That's Kronos and the Titans, overthrown by Zeus and the Olympians. Of course, that's the fake news version of the story. The Bible's got the actual history. But when you start reading, and this is what blew my mind, when you start reading about the religions of the other people who lived around the Mediterranean back in the time from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on down, you've got the Hittites and the Hurrians and the Canaanites and the Amorites, the Akkadians, the Sumerians, going back 5,000 years. They all have the same pattern repeated over and over, that there was a sky god once who ruled, and he was overthrown by his son, variously named Enlil or El or Dagon or Kumarbi or Kronos or Saturn, and I get the names mixed up in my own head, Baal, Haman, whatever. And then he in turn is overthrown by a storm god, Marduk, Baal, Teshub, Tarhunta, Zeus, Jupiter, and so on. It's the same pattern repeated over and over.
My name's Nick. I'm the owner of Kevlar Joe's, and I'm the roaster. I'm an Air Force Security Forces veteran, a dad to 3 wild boys, and a husband to my wife, Crystal, and a coffee enthusiast. From a family in a small town in Missouri, we started with the simple idea of crafting a perfectly bold cup of coffee. Inspired by wellness and countless pots of stale coffee while deployed, we wanted to craft a bold, clean, and smooth coffee. So we did. And we realized we wanted to share this coffee with our friends. Lord knows we could all use a good cup of coffee right about now. From the farm to your coffee cup, there's nothing like a good, well-crafted, and bold cup of coffee. No matter what time of the day, it's there to pick you up, motivate you, and relax you. We hope you enjoy our coffee. Be bold, be humble, be Kevlar. And you can find Kevlar Joe's Coffee Company anytime you want at www.kevlarjoe.com. And for listeners of the Dig Bible Podcast, use the code, all caps, DIG20, whenever you're checking out to get a 20% off discount. Enjoy.
This is Timothy Albrino, and you're listening to the Dig Bible Podcast.
We should read our Bible
as men digging for buried treasure. The Bible is the world's most popular enigma. Its secrets lost to cultures beneath the sands of time. Or is it?
It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out. God wants you to seek, to read His Word, to look for that knowledge. He wants you to do that.
Man, the people at Nicaea, they chopped out 80 books of the Bible. We need to bring those back.
There's more bad guys in this thing than a Bruce Willis movie.
Oh, yeah.
Let's back it up here.
I love the intro to your show because it's exactly right. There's these nuggets of gold in his word.
As you guys always say in the show, you got to dig it. Dig it.
Show us your nuggets.
God, our Creator, lies outside of time and space and matter.
I feel like God'd be like, "Hello, McFly."
You ain't got it so far, then.
There are secret societies think that they are the descendants of the giant.
I mean, isn't this exciting? I mean, you read it, it's like, wow.
The Nephalology Round Table.
But these angels were taken to help immediately. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. You're out of the game.
Dirty hands means clean theology. Can you dig it? What's going on, all my local guys and gals and long distance pals?
We're back.
We're back. Stephen no longer shakes his head. I think he's accepted it.
Yeah, I think it's he learns that it's here. It's just gonna happen.
Yeah. It's like a constrictive pair of underwear. First it's constrictive, but then it just becomes a part of you.
That's a weird
terrible analogy.
That's weird.
Analogy.
Oh. Well, did you guys enjoy the kids at home today? Got out for rain.
And tomorrow.
Yeah, so my kids are
didn't get that memo.
homeschooled, so that didn't happen.
Yeah, they're out. They're out tomorrow too.
We actually had to go out and cut trees down to try to get out of school in a foot of snow, and still had to go to school.
Oh yeah.
Now a cat pees in the wintertime, and its roads are froze.
And baseball started.
I'm excited. I love baseball.
See, I never liked baseball, and like I told you, Jackson's just now playing. He had his first game the other day. He actually got on base his first at bat, but then he struck out the other two. But yeah, it's really hard. Even though it's my son, it's hard to watch.
I used to love living in Florida. I played it till I saw how hard those guys could throw, and I was like, nope, backing up.
I played all the way up through high school.
But those guys, I miss living in Florida for spring training. Spring training was so much fun to be able to be part of that, be around it. It was a good time. I actually even worked at the Yankees ball field in Tampa for a little while when I was a lot younger, but it was a good time.
We used the all-star soccer player.
Back in the day.
You played some college ball.
Long time ago. I can't emphasize the long enough.
Well, I can watch baseball a whole lot better than I can watch basketball.
Now, see, now that's my game. I love basketball.
I'm not a basketball fan.
Non-stop action. Now, soccer and baseball, no offense, Stephen.
Yeah.
But all that
see,
running
I can't watch soccer
hardly any
either.
scoring.
Some offense taken.
Sorry.
But
you'll get over it.
Anyway, maybe we should get back on topic here.
Back it up, I guess. Well, we got another great guest for you guys. Before we get into that, I guess we'll go into prayer. Ben, go ahead this time.
Dear Lord, thank you for today. Please give us some discernment. Please have this message or whatever we're going to talk about here reach who it needs to reach. Thank you for this crazy but awesome weather. Can't wait till spring. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. We had a scheduling malfunction this week, and luckily we got a real good friend that helped us out in a pinch. Yes. We got with us Derek. How you doing, Derek?
I'm doing great. We're getting some rain here in the Ozarks too, but kind of funny. Every time they issue a weather, like a flood watch, here we're about 1,300 feet above sea level. We're about 400 feet above Lake of the Ozarks, Table Rock Lake just below us. So if we're going to flood here, the whole Midwest is going to be underwater. So we'll get
great
wet,
deluge.
but we're not going to flood. Yeah, exactly.
Same thing here. If it really ever got bad enough, we're at about the same height above sea level. If it floods here, then God lied about the rainbow. Let's put it that way. And we know that's not true. So.
That's right.
Well, technically, if we don't flood completely,
okay.
we really need flood the whole world, you know.
Yeah. No ocean
just 98% of it.
Yeah.
Why don't we kind of jump a little bit into I know, Derek, you had said that you're kind of digging a little more, and we've talked to you a little bit about this in the past, just a little bit, and I don't think it was on the show. I think it was in person, I do believe. But we're going to kind of delve into a little bit the is Lucifer really Satan? And the kind of the, where that idea came from traditionally, and kind of really delve into that. And I'm really interested in this, and I'll tell you, and to be totally honest with you, I was a Lutheran, raised a Lutheran for most of my life, and it was just common knowledge. That's what it was. Lucifer was Satan, and I never questioned it. And I think that's a really it's just something that you never even thought to question until you start reading your own Bible and you start saying, that's interesting.
Yeah, I was raised Southern Baptist practically,
but that's how
that's kind of how I
was
perceive.
Taught.
Yeah. Well, most even all the English translations, the majority of them, do say Lucifer. So even if you do read your Bible, it can be confusing.
And I was raised in liturgical denominations too, United Church of Christ and then Lutheran, and it was just sort of taken as. It wasn't until about 2 years ago, really, that I started to change my mind on this. Well, maybe 2.5 years ago. Friend of ours back about 10 years ago wrote a book that I am now rereading. David W. Lowe, who wrote the excellent book Earthquake Resurrection, wrote a book called Deconstructing Lucifer about 10 years ago. And I interviewed him, and because we like David, he's a very careful researcher, very good author. He's an accountant by training, and so everything has got to be very precise. The ledgers have to balance. And so he comes out with this book, Deconstructing Lucifer, and he argues that Lucifer is not Satan. And I'm like, oh, David, bless your pointy little head. Everybody knows. Everybody knows Lucifer is Satan. Come on, it's right there in the Bible. Well, about 3 years ago, when I decided to try to follow up and try to put together the research that Sharon and I have been collecting over the last 7 years about Shemiyaza, who's this character who appears only in the book of First Enoch as the leader of that rebellious group of supernatural beings, angels, if you want to use that term, who come down to Mount Hermon, which is that big mountain right on the border between Israel and Syria and Lebanon, and decide to corrupt humanity by taking human wives and creating these hybrid giants and then teaching us forbidden knowledge. Shemiyaza is, according to Enoch, is in the bottomless pit. He's in basically in a deep, dark hole. And then Peter and Jude confirm this in the New Testament, where they both mention it. The angels who sinned are in chains and gloomy darkness. And Peter is very specific. He says, for if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them down to hell, except the word in Greek is Tartarosis, which means Tartarus. That's not Hades, which is where the human dead presumably go. It's not Sheol in the Hebrew mind. Tartarus was a special place reserved for supernatural rebels. So it's a pretty good theory then that this Shemiyaza, because Peter and Jude are both clearly referring to the Genesis 6 incident, which is what's described in First Enoch. If Shemiyaza is in Tartarus with these sinful angels, the Greeks in their theology, what we call mythology, believed that there were a group of old gods who were in the underworld, in Tartarus. That's Kronos and the Titans, overthrown by Zeus and the Olympians. Of course, that's the fake news version of the story. The Bible's got the actual history. But when you start reading, and this is what blew my mind, when you start reading about the religions of the other people who lived around the Mediterranean back in the time from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on down, you got the Hittites and the Hurrians and the Canaanites and the Amorites, the Akkadians, the Sumerians, going back 5,000 years. They all have the same pattern repeated over and over, that there was a sky god once who ruled, and he was overthrown by his son, variously named Enlil or El or Dagon or Kumarbi or Kronos, or I'm getting ahead. Kronos or Saturn. And I get the names mixed up in my own head. Baal, Haman, whatever. And then he in turn is overthrown by a storm god. Marduk, Baal, Teshub, Tarhunta, Zeus, Jupiter, and so on. It's the same pattern repeated over and over. And the more you read, the research from these scholars who specialize in reading these ancient texts and translating them, it's essentially just telling the same story that had been passed on from one culture to another and down the centuries. So we've got that story where this old entity, Shemiyaza, logically would be the king of the Titans, the leader of this group that was sent down to Tartarus, the netherworld, the bottomless pit, the abyss, the guy that the Greeks called Kronos and the Romans called Saturn. So I started doing some more reading into this entity and looking for evidence that he's in the Bible. I mean, he seems kind of like a big deal. If he led this rebellion in Genesis 6 that created these hybrid creatures called the Nephilim, later called the Rephaim, and their spirits were believed by the Jews of Jesus' day and the early church to be the demons. The spirits of these giants destroyed in the flood were not allowed into the regular places in the afterlife reserved for the human dead. They weren't allowed into the realms of heaven with God and his loyal angels. They were condemned, according to 1 Enoch, to wander the earth, tormenting humanity until the judgment. That was the belief of the early church. It's like, that's kind of a big deal. So why isn't this entity mentioned in the Bible? Well, as I said, he went by many different names. He is in the Bible if we care to look. Enlil, El, Asher, the chief god of the Assyrians, Molech, mentioned more than a couple times in the Old Testament, the god who demanded child sacrifice. He's in there. But as I was doing this research, I came across the references to Asher in Isaiah chapter 14. Now, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, those are the two parallel chapters that we assume, or we've been taught rather, refer to the fall of Satan, Satan being kicked out of the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3. So I started looking very carefully into Isaiah 14. That's the very famous chapter that in the King James says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning?" You go back to verse 4, and there's a reference to the king of Babylon. You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, how the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. Now, remember now, the king of Babylon in Hebrew is Melech Bab-El. Bab-El is the same word as for the Tower of Babel.
The gate of the gods.
Context assumed. Right, gate of the gods. That's what it means in Assyrian. Bab-Eli, the Akkadian Bab-Ilu, gate of the gods, or the God gate. So are we talking about the king of Babylon here, or the king of the God gate? Okay. And I ask this question because as we go further down, there's a reference to the Assyrian, but I'll explain why I don't believe this refers to the Assyrian. Continuing in Isaiah 14, we see that this entity, whoever's being described here, this king of Babel, is told that he's going to be greeted by the Rephaim in Sheol. That's the underworld. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the Rephaim. The English word usually translated shades, but it's Rephaim in Hebrew. The Rephaim to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. This is a reference to the spirits of the Nephilim. All who were kings of the nations, all of them will answer and say to you, you have become as weak as we, etc., etc. You get to verse 12 in the ESV, it's, O Daystar, son of dawn, O Lucifer, son of the moon, in the King James. And I'll explain how we get to Lucifer here in just a bit. This is a condemnation of this entity who wanted to essentially elevate himself above God. Isaiah 14:13, you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. Actually, in the Hebrew, it's above the stars of El. So is it referring to Yahweh, the God of the Bible, or is it referring to El, the creator God of the Canaanites? In other words, if it's referring to the entity that I think it is, Isaiah 14:13 might be saying that this entity wants to elevate himself above his minions. Stars referring to the angels of the heavenly realm. Either way, this guy's got an ego problem. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly, the Har Moed, which, by the way, is the Hebrew phrase from which John got the Greek transliteration Armageddon. Okay? The mount of assembly, everyone in the ancient world knew that's where the gods met and decided the fates of the nations. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, but you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Okay. Then we get down to verses 24 through 25. Now let me read verse 22. I will rise up against them, declares Yahweh of hosts. It's a term used of God in the Old Testament dozens of times, literally. It means Yahweh of armies. God is a military commander. And will cut off from Babylon, I will cut off from Bab-el, from Bab-elu, from the God gate, name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares Yahweh. Why is that important? Because in the ancient world, it was known that if your descendants forgot your name, if they didn't perform a monthly ritual called the Kispum, an Amorite, if on the 30th day of the month, the night of no moon, they didn't call your name and summon you through a necromancy ritual to a family meal where your spirits were fed and given a drink offering, you would cease to exist. There's a reference to that in 2 Samuel 18:18, where you see that Absalom, the son of David, erected a pillar for himself in the Valley of the Kings, for he had no son to keep his name in remembrance. That's why, if your descendants didn't summon you, didn't call your name once a month to give you food and drink, you ceased to exist. You were forgotten and you faded away to nothing.
Even Abraham talked about that, didn't he? Because he said, what was it, his servant, the cupbearer, who would bear my cup.
Eleazar.
Yeah.
Right. Actually, it's a little play on language, or perhaps a scribe who didn't understand what the phrase meant. A scholar by the name of Nicholas Wyatt pointed this out in the story. Eleazar of Damascus. Dr. Wyatt believes that the original Hebrew was Eleazar ben Meshech, meaning son of the cup, because it was the responsibility of the oldest son in the family to summon the family to this meal once a month and then call out the names of the ancestors in this ritual and then pour out the drink offering. He was the pourer of water, or the son of the cup. But later you get into say the post-Babylonian exile, which would be about 1,300 years later. Scholar might not have known what that meant. He said, this must be a reference to Damascus, Ha-Damashek, instead of Ben Meshech. Ha-Damashek, Eleazar of Damascus. And so that's why we get that. But yeah, I think that's why Abraham and Sarah were concerned. I mean, they were in their 90s and they didn't have a son to keep their name in remembrance. That was a really big deal in the ancient world. There are texts found among the Amorites where contracts were drawn up. People who didn't have an heir to perform this ritual would hire contractors basically to do it after they died. That's so crazy. It's I know it's crazy to us, but to them that was part of their worldview.
Well, even the Hispanics, the Day of the Dead, they offer food and drinks.
And that's the part. And you talk about this a lot. When we go back and think about the way that Michael Heiser always taught us about this as well, is we have to look at it through the eyes of the people at that time. When we try to put things into our modern day perspective, everything sounds crazy. A lot of the rituals, a lot of the ceremonies, a lot of the belief systems of so many of those countries obviously wouldn't make sense to us, but we have to look at it through their eyes.
Absolutely. That's the only way it makes sense, because it was written for the people in that day. So when we look at these things, I just did an interview with the Dean of Biblical Studies at Trinity Southwest University, who argues that the ages of the patriarchs are not meant to be taken literally. Like it says Abraham lived to be 175. It doesn't mean he actually lived to be 175. Those numbers were given to Abraham and Moses, Joseph, who lived to the age of 110, as a way of honoring them. They didn't look at history and numbers the way we do in the 21st century.
Wow.
The number 70 means all of them, the complete set. So did King Ahab actually have 70 sons? Probably not. But what it means is when his 70 sons were killed, it means that they all died, every last one of them. That's how they viewed things back in the day. And when we look at this and say, well, it's got to be 175 years or you're dissing the Bible. No. And Dr. Olson makes that clear in this presentation, but it's just another example of how we need to look at how they viewed the world and try to see it through their eyes. So when they're talking about things that don't make sense to us. Like, for example, in Isaiah 14:19, there was a reference to the loathed branch. This is referring to this entity, Lucifer, if you will, cast out away from your grave like a loathed branch. You know, even considering there's like 2,700 years between us and Isaiah, what does that even mean? Scholar pointed out that the word translated branch in Hebrew is netzer, but there's a homonym or a word in Egyptian that sounds almost identical to netzer that means divinized corpse. And it's usually applied to Osiris, who is the god of the dead in Egypt. So when you see it in the context of Isaiah 14, that this guy, this entity who wanted to elevate himself above God in the heavens, above the Most High, is now being cast down to Sheol, to the farthest reaches of the pit, where he's cast out away from his grave, like a dead body trampled underfoot. Suddenly this makes sense. Not like a loathed branch, it's like a loathed, divinized corpse. And again, remember that the Rephaim were believed to be the spirits of the mighty kings who lived long, long ago, like the heroes of the Greeks. So in context, that makes sense. But we lost that because we don't understand the cult of the dead in the ancient world, don't consider the possibility that the Hebrews might have used some Egyptian or Aramaic loanwords. And so we try to find a Hebrew explanation for it, and that's how we get loathed branch in Isaiah 14:19 instead of loathed God of the dead, which is what this entity turned out to be. The bottom line here is I go into this in real detail in the book, The Second Coming of Saturn. In this kind of format, it can get really dry really fast. The bottom line is that Isaiah 14 in this Lucifer passage, and then the corresponding passage in Ezekiel 28, which is the guardian cherub who covers, who is kicked off Eden, the mountain of God. Those are the two chapters that pastors will point to, Bible teachers will point to and say, see, this is where Satan was kicked out of heaven. And this is where we get this idea that Lucifer is the name for Satan. But a couple problems with this. First of all, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 do not mention the events of Genesis chapter 3, which is the temptation in the garden. They don't mention it. So it's not a given that the rebel in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 was the same entity who tempted Adam and Eve to take and eat the forbidden fruit, the Nakash in the garden. And that actually helps explain one of the questions I've always had about Ezekiel 28. Verse 14, you were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you, you were on the holy mountain of God. Now, we know what a cherub looks like thanks to Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 1, Ezekiel chapter 10, these are these winged beings that have four faces: human, ox, lion, and eagle. But the Nakash is described as serpentine. And in fact, we see a couple places like Numbers 21 and Isaiah 14 and Isaiah 30 where you get references to the Nakash and the seraphim used interchangeably. Like the flying fiery serpents, the fiery serpents that were biting the people in the desert because they had sinned against God. If the Nakash and the seraphim are interchangeable, and we know what the seraphim look like because of Isaiah chapter 6, his throne room vision. They got the 6 wings and hooves for feet. Very weird. And if they're possibly serpentine in appearance because they're used interchangeably with Nakash, which is usually translated serpent in the Bible, how can the anointed guardian cherub be the same entity as the Nakash, the serpent in the garden? Well, if they're not the same entity, problem solved. And in fact, there's a hint of this in the Septuagint translation of Ezekiel chapter 28. That's the version of the Bible that was translated from Hebrew into Greek about 200 years before Jesus was born. So this gives us an idea into what Jewish religious scholars and how they interpreted their Old Testament in the centuries before Jesus and the apostles walked the earth. In the Septuagint, now this is translated into English, obviously, from the Greek, from the older Hebrew text. From the day you were created, I placed you with the cherub in the holy mountain of God. In the holy mountain of God.
Whether you're pre-trib or pre-wrath, it's important to dispose of the pretense that expensive insurance is something that you're stuck with. Most people don't shop around for better insurance rates until years after they get their policies. And with the price of a loaf of bread slowly approaching a day's wages, it's important to save where you can. That's why the Better Insurance Agency is here to help with options for home, auto, life, and small business insurance. Visit us online at www.thebetterquote.com or call us at 540-200-8646 today to see about switching to a better insurance company. Currently available only in Virginia and Tennessee. Please note that if you're listening to this commercial after the rapture has taken place, the Better Insurance Agency is probably closed.
Two separate entities here. The rebel was not the guardian cherub, the anointed cherub who covered, but he was there with the cherub. And then in verse 16, because of the abundance of your merchandise, you filled the treasuries with lawlessness, and you sinned and were wounded from the mountain of God, and the cherub led you out of the middle of the fiery stones. In other words, the cherub tossed you out, the guardian cherub who covered. So I think that's what we're looking at here. It's not the Nakash necessarily. And again, you've got the possibility here, thanks to the Septuagint, that you're dealing with two separate entities, that the cherub and the rebel are not even the same entity at all. So this is opening the possibility then that perhaps the rebellion in Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 are something other than what happened in Genesis chapter 3. And because of Peter and Jude, who both point out that angels who sinned were in the bottomless pit, and it's clear from their writing, 2 Peter chapter 2 and Jude beginning at verse 6, the sin was sexual, which can only be Genesis chapter 6. There were other divine beings who rebelled against God. It's not just Satan. He's not the only one who got kicked out of the divine assembly. And when you look at, so the next question is, how did the Jews generally view Satan? Do they connect Satan with the netherworld? Do they connect Satan as this great rebel of God? In the Old Testament, he's barely even mentioned. And when he is mentioned, it's not even a proper name. It's Ha-Satan, the Satan. It's a job title, the adversary. You see him in 1 Chronicles 21, Job chapters 1 and 2, and Zechariah 3, verses 1 and 2. Those are the only places in the Old Testament where Satan is even mentioned. In the Jewish mind, he was not this great enemy. He was sort of like a prosecuting attorney who was doing a job for God, pointing out the flaws in God's creation, especially the human part of his creation. You think Job is all that great? Well, hey, let me test him a little bit, and we'll see we'll see how well he does. But nowhere in the Old Testament, in those few references to the Satan, do you see any connection between Satan and the netherworld? Unlike Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, where clearly that rebel was tossed out and is now down there with the Rephaim, not just in Sheol, but in the far reaches of the pit, which I think may be a kind of a euphemism, a Hebrew way of saying the bottomless pit or Tartarus. He's not connected to Rephaim in any way, unlike the rebel in Isaiah 14. And according to Job and Zechariah, he still had access to the throne room of God.
That's something that's always confused me, honestly. Right. I was like, so was he just demoted and he was summoned when God wanted him, or how did that work? That's something I always wondered in my head.
Yeah. So where do we get the idea that Satan is the Lord of hell? Because the Jews certainly didn't have that idea. And coming back to the book Deconstructing Lucifer by our friend David W. Lowe, he does a really good job of documenting that the early church didn't see Satan as this entity either, sitting in the netherworld with flames all around with a pitchfork and horns and a tail. That was not the Satan. And by the way, I only learned this a few months ago, thanks to our friend Doug Van Dorn. Even in the Greek New Testament, Satan is not a proper name either. It is Ho-Satanas. It's the Satan all the way through the Bible. So,
and you've made this connection with
a proper name.
And you're the one that made this connection with Shemzaza, because when I was reading David Lowe's book, one of the things that I just was really having trouble getting was he keeps saying that Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 was not supernatural at all. That's what I was picking up from it. He was saying, no, they're addressing a king. And then he even went as far as saying that when they're addressing the guardian cherub and you were in Eden, perfection, that it was Adam.
Yeah. No, I disagree with David there. I think he did a really good job of showing how Satan became the Satan that we know. But I think when we're looking at Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, we've got to look at another character. I do think that those were addressed to the king of Babylon, perhaps, although I raised the speculation in my book that it's actually directed at the king of the God Gate, who I think was the king over those in the bottomless pit, Abaddon, Apollyon, who's just another identity worn by Saturn, Kronos, Enlil, Molech, etc., Shemiyaza. I think same entity, different names.
Could it be just randomly, but could it be the like a King of Tyre situation where maybe it's referring to two separate entities? You know, what we're talking about, obviously one part of it is talking about the King of Tyre and the other part is talking about someone supernatural at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that was the condition. That was the opinion of our friend, the late Dr. Michael Heiser, that yes, he was directing it at these human entities. I always question Isaiah directing it at the king of Babylon, because during Isaiah's day, the Assyrians were still the dominant political power. Babylon was like a vassal state. So why would Isaiah be directing this at the king of Babylon? The king of Babylon was basically a flunky who was handpicked by the king of Assyria. Now, again, there would be a future day about 100 years after Isaiah where the Babylonians would become the dominant power in the ancient Near East. But at the time Isaiah wrote, it was not. It was the Assyrians who were the major power. And again, when you get that reference to the Assyrian in Isaiah 14, you've got this problem with the definite article the. It's not there. In Hebrew, Ashur refers to the chief god of the Assyrians, who was just Enlil or El or Molech, Shemiyaza by a different name. It could also refer to the capital city of the Assyrians, and it also referred to Assyria, the country. So when you see references in the Old Testament to the Assyrian, which is sometimes taken as a prophecy of the Antichrist in the book of Micah, the Assyrian. Well, Isaiah 14 is a similar prophecy where he, prophesies the condemnation or the destruction of the Assyrian. I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot. But again, the definite article, ha, or the, is not in the Hebrew. I will break Ashur in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot. So does that mean the Assyrians? Well, that wasn't quite fulfilled. The Babylonians wiped out the Assyrians in northern Mesopotamia. The final battle was near the city of Haran. I think it's, again, this is speculation. I'm not going to die on this theological hill, but I think it's a reference to this entity, Ashur, Enlil, Molech, Saturn, Kronos, Baal-Hamon, Shemiyaza, Apollyon, Abaddon. I think that's who's in view in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. But again, the question is, how do we get from there? This idea that nobody in the Jewish world ever has seen Satan in those chapters, and the early church didn't see Satan in Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28. How did this happen? Well, again, this is where David W. Lowe did some really great research. He pointed out that it wasn't until the 2nd century, or Ignatius of Antioch, early 2nd century, like around the year 108 AD, that's when Ignatius died. So in that first decade of the 2nd century, less than 20 years after John wrote the book of Revelation, Ignatius connected Satan to Luke 10, verse 18, which is where Jesus says that he saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. And then, thus, this was the connection between Satan and Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 that was picked up on by Justin Martyr, who was in the middle of the 2nd century AD. He was the first early church father to connect Isaiah 14:12 to Satan falling from heaven. Oh, Lucifer, how art thou fallen from heaven? Tertullian in the 2nd century, Irenaeus in the 2nd century, Tertullian actually early 3rd century. Origen
said something about that in that, was it De Principis that he wrote? Referred to him that way as well?
early 3rd century, and he was the first one. He is actually where we get where the name Lucifer comes about. Okay, because in the Hebrew, and by the way, this is another. I should have mentioned this to keep this together, but getting late in the day and the blood sugar is not where it ought to be. The word translated Lucifer, or words translated Lucifer, son of the morning, in the King James, in the Hebrew is actually Halel ben Shachar, which means light bringer, son of dawn. And Origen translated Halel with the Greek word Hiosphoros. The Greek word Hiosphoros, and then into Latin, lux meaning light, and pharos meaning to carry, so light bringer. And then later, when Jerome translated the Vulgate, he took what Origen had written in the 3rd century, about 100 years earlier, and 200 years earlier, and transferred that and took that compound word, lux, pharos, light bringer, and made it a proper name, Lucifer. So people who are convinced that Lucifer is the name of the devil are unaware that this is a translation of the original Hebrew, Halel ben Shachar.
Yeah, I think David said he chose to do a transliteration instead of a translation.
Correct, yes. And here's the thing. A scholar by the name of William Gallagher, back in the early 90s, almost 30 years ago now, and Doug Hamp put me onto this, wrote a paper in which he showed that Halel is actually a West Semitic, like Canaanite or Hebrew transliteration of the Akkadian name Elil, which is the Akkadian form of Enlil. So this would suggest that Isaiah 14 is actually directed at this entity that the Hebrews also referred to as Molech, a god known among the Greeks and Romans and the Phoenicians for demanding child sacrifice. That he was the rebel in view, and it kind of makes sense. Now, again, it's kind of speculative because this is not explicit anywhere in the Bible, but think about this. This entity, if I'm correct in my theory, that this is Shemiyaza, the leader of the rebellion, in Genesis chapter 6, the one who led the group of 200 on the summit of Mount Hermon to say, let us take wives and father children, and they produced these monstrous offspring. When God decided to send a flood to put a stop to that and chained these entities up in the netherworld, in the bottomless pit, they were helpless for 5 months while their children were being destroyed in the flood of Noah. And we know it was 5 months exactly because in Genesis 7 and Genesis 8, we're told that the ark was on the water for 150 days. And this is more evidence, I think, that my theory is correct, that this entity is also the destroyer, Abaddon or Apollyon, who comes out of the abyss, the bottomless pit, in Revelation 9. Because in Revelation 9, these entities, led by Abaddon and Apollyon, are given 5 months exactly to torment those without the seal of God on their foreheads. Now, why? I mean, again, talking about the importance of numbers in the ancient world, 150 is not one of those common numbers. 7, 3, 7, 10, 40, 70, those are all very important numbers. 100, important, but 150, 5 months. No, it's the only 2 places in the Bible where you see that number. It's bookending. These same entities who watched their children die for 5 months get out at the end to torment humanity for 5 months. And in between time, they have influenced humanities through their intermediaries, these demons that they fathered, to take our own children and offer them up as sacrifices. Number 1 cause of death on planet Earth for the last 4 years running, at least the last 4 years where I could check the numbers, is abortion.
Yeah. And Tim
Depending on which numbers you look.
Tim Stedman, he come on the show and was talking about there's also a correlation how, the people at that time, they were, farmers and sheep herders and stuff like that. That is the gestation period of a small farm animal. So there's another, baby connection.
The baby connection.
The baby connection.
So I think the theory fits together. And I think also you've got to consider this. These entities, led by this creature, the destroyer, Shemiyaza, Abaddon, Apollyon, They're in chains in gloomy darkness, according to Peter and Jude. They've been locked up in the bottomless pit for millennia, while Satan is still roaming the earth, seeking whom he may devour, according to Peter. Does this suggest that God considered Shemiyaza, Abaddon, Apollyon more dangerous than Satan? I think it does. I mean, he could have just stopped what they were doing. But not only did he stop what they were doing, according to Peter and Jude, he put them in chains and locked them up in the bottomless pit. Whereas Satan was still allowed to continue doing what he was doing. Or the Satan. Is there more than one Satan?
I think that's I think that's the really interesting thing, Derek, when we talk about that being more of a title. So, we want to, the modern church wants to always, and I mean, and this is how I was raised, and, evil is evil to some degree, but when you talk about this and you look at the fact that that is not a proper name, it just means the adversary or the tempter or the accuser. I mean, we have all these different I guess, titles that go along with that. And we see that that's given throughout time. Everybody wants to think that, that was Satan in the garden, Lucifer in the garden. I mean, there's so many different things where if this all fits together, that right there already puts a kind of I guess, kind of a hole in that whole theory of Lucifer being Satan. It just doesn't add up.
Yeah, I agree. And then we can get into all kinds of speculation as to what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because in the Old Testament, again, it's clear that this entity has a certain role that he performs, where he accuses or tempts Job. He certainly tempts David into conducting the census. He's accusing the high priest Joshua in the time of Zechariah. But by the time you get to the New Testament, he's going way beyond that, tempting Jesus. And according to Jesus in Matthew 12, where he is confronted by the religious leaders of the day who say he's accused him of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, which male the prince. Jesus responds and says, if Satan casts out demons by his own power, how will his kingdom stand? It's like, wait a minute, suddenly he's got a kingdom? When did that happen? How did this happen?
Revelation 12.
Revelation 12. Happened at the time of Jesus' birth. Now the question is that the same Satan, the same adversary, was in the garden? Because among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I get it, these are not scriptures, but it does give us an idea as to how Jews understood their scriptures. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, there's a prayer that asks God to protect them from the Satans, plural.
This is another way I like to think about it is if you look at the history of Egypt, for example, how many times did a god rise up and then another god came and struck him down and became the head of the gods, and then it follows down throughout a lot of those Assyrian, Akkadian histories. It's the same thing where you see another god rise up and he's the head of that. And I kind of always, and I mean, I shouldn't say always because this is more obviously recently, but I start to think that maybe that direct correlation to Satan is who is at the head of the realm at that time, the dark realm. Does that make sense? Or am I way off the rails?
No, absolutely. And Sharon works this into her series of fiction, the Red Wing saga, where she's got competition between members of the fallen realm. And I'm working on a follow-up to my novel, The God Conspiracy, where I'm bringing more of this in. The God Conspiracy, I started back in 2003. I didn't know anything. And so I had to kind of wait, let it percolate for a while, rewrote it, re-edited it, put it out again a couple of years ago when suddenly the whole idea of an enforced vaccine became a lot more relevant than it had before I started writing the book. But if we look at politics in the human realm, okay, look at the 2020 election. Democrats were agreed that they didn't want Donald Trump to get back in the White House, but then they were fighting with each other like cats and dogs to be the one to take his place. Why do we assume the same thing isn't happening in the fallen realm? Like it's Satan and all of his little minions. It's like, no. Look at Revelation. You got the mystery Babylon, the whore riding, the whore of Babylon riding the beast, the Antichrist. Like she thinks she's controlling where it's going. And Sharon makes a really good case that this is Inanna or Ishtar or Astarte, the queen of heaven, she's called in the Bible. She thinks she's going to wind up running the show in the end times. And then these 10 kings who we don't believe are human kings, the kings who are aligned with the beast, we believe are supernatural entities. Okay, these are other fallen Elohim who think that somehow they're going to manage to push Yahweh off his throne, and then they'll figure out who gets to take his place. And in my follow-up novel, I'm working with that as more of an aspect of the plot than I did with the God conspiracy. I mean, there was a supernatural aspect there, but it wasn't a whole lot. Just the competition between these entities was sort of hinted at. It's going to be more overt in this follow-up novel. So because I think it's really interesting when you see how this happens. In fact, there's even a hint of it in some of the Mesopotamian texts. A scholar wrote a paper a couple of years ago, and I'm going to forget his name, sadly, but it's a history of Enlil. And again, Enlil, one of the names or identities worn by this character, who I believe is Shemiyaza in ancient times and the destroyer in the future. Enlil was introduced into Sumer when the Akkadians moved in under Sargon the Great in the 24th century BC. Before the arrival of the Akkadians, the entity, the deity who was believed to convey kingship onto human rulers was Inanna, or Ishtar, the goddess of sex and war. After the Akkadians came in and brought the worship of Enlil, and the Amorites came with El, again, same entity, different names, suddenly it was Enlil who was conveying kingship. I think there's competition between these entities, kind of reflected in politics in the human realm. But I think it's behind the scenes. I think you're seeing these supernatural beings that are competing for power as well in the spirit realm. And I think as we get closer to the end, that competition is going to ramp up and become more overt as they realize their time is growing short. And again, I think there's more evidence that this creature that I'm talking about, Saturn, Kronos, Baal-Hamon, Enlil, El, Molech, Asher, etc., is Dagon, is all through the Bible. He's there if we know what we're looking for. First of all, you have to look at context whenever you see the word El, usually translated God in the Old Testament, but it doesn't always necessarily refer to Yahweh, the God of the Bible. Secondly, there's this is one that blew my mind. In Zechariah chapter 4, there's a real famous verse that many of us have heard, but we don't read it all the way through and understand the context. In Mesopotamia, this chief god or creator god, Enlil, Asher, Dagon, was called the Great Mountain. That was his nickname or his epithet. In fact, his temple in the city of Nippur was called the Ikur, which means house of the mountain or the mountain house. And that's where all of the gods met once a year to decree the fates of the nations. What's really fascinating about Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel chapter 1 is not that he's seeing wheels within wheels that Giorgio Tsoukalos assures us is a UFO. No, and Ezekiel emphasizes this point to make sure we get it. He says it's over the Kivar Canal, Chebar, the Kivar Canal. 8 times in the book of Ezekiel, he makes reference to the vision that I had at the first over the Kivar Canal, or at the Kivar Canal. That's important because the Kivar Canal branched off the Euphrates and ran right through the city of Nippur, which means that his vision of the throne room of God with the throne guardians, the cherubim, and these ophanim, the wheels within wheels with eyes all around, and the glory of God, it manifested directly over the house of the mountain, the place that was believed to be the most important spiritual location in all of Mesopotamia, where the gods would meet once a year to decree the fates of the land. Okay, so everybody in Mesopotamia knew who the great mountain was. Now look at Zechariah chapter 4, beginning at verse 6. Then he said to me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. We've all heard that verse. But the next line, verse 7, who are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you shall become a plain. Bible teachers will usually say, well, this means, Zerubbabel, he was in charge of rebuilding the temple. He had a really hard job, and that was his mountain that he had to overcome. He had to level out that mountain, the problem of rebuilding the temple. No, the Israelites had just come back from 70 years in Mesopotamia. They knew who the great mountain was. God was mocking the creator God, the father of the gods of the Mesopotamians, the Akkadians and the Babylonians, who had enslaved the Israelites for 70 years. Who are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you're going to become a plain. We see another reference to this, I think, in Jeremiah 51, verse 25. This is in the context of condemning Babylon. And remember, in Babylon, their father God, the creator, was Enlil, the great mountain. Behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain, declares the Lord, which destroys the whole earth. I will stretch out my hand against you and roll you down from the crags and make you a burnt mountain. Without understanding the religious context of Mesopotamia and who the great mountain was, it's a metaphor. It's picturesque language.
Now, was it Mount Hermon where it was, I think, and I could be wrong, but El and his 70 sons ruled the nations also?
Right. Yeah, the Canaanite religious texts found at the city-state of Ugarit, which is an Amorite kingdom that was destroyed around the time of the Judges, about 1200 BC. It was believed that was the abode of El, which is described as being at the source of the two deeps, or the double deep, which is interesting when you remember that psalm, deep calls to deep, and makes reference to the region, the Upper Jordan near Mount Hermon. Anyway, he was believed to be that was his mount of assembly, his Har Moed, where El and Asherah and their 70 sons, and again the 70 mean the number representing all of the gods of the nations. One scholar refers to Mount Hermon as the Semitic Olympus. It's the equivalent of Mount Olympus for the Semites. And when you read the Ugaritic texts, man, it is so clear that region is just full of meaning. Sharon and I are leaving for Israel in less than 2 weeks, and we're going to be there 5 days before the tour gets there, so we can shoot some video at some of those megalithic sites in the Golan, because the Golan Heights is the ancient kingdom of Bashan. So, we're looking forward to getting to Gilgal Rephaim, that serpent mound of Bashan. Mount Hermon is like 25 miles north of there. Those references in Scripture have a supernatural meaning. It's just we've lost the context. And so, again, even in Jewish texts outside of the Bible, like the book of First Enoch, when Enoch was taken down to the netherworld to see the angels who'd been punished for disobedience, they're described as burning mountains. In Revelation 8, you've got the great mountain burning with fire thrown into the sea. I don't think those are actual geological features or meteorites. I think we're talking about supernatural entities here. And that's who's in view when you're looking at Isaiah 14. Lucifer is not Satan. Lucifer is Saturn. Lucifer is El. Lucifer is Enlil. Lucifer is Shemiyaza, the leader of the rebellion in Genesis 6.
And there's your mic drop moment right there, when we really look at everything and you just you kind of throw it down there. When I was looking at this, I thought it was pretty interesting as we went along, and I looked at not only did I look at some of the, you take it into such depth beyond anything that
beyond what any rational person would want to know.
Well, no, you don't.
That's why we love you.
That's exactly why we love you, because you take it and your knowledge base and the drive you have to research this stuff. It makes it easier for us to look into it and kind of connect the dots for us. But I like looking also at the kind of the historical side of things. When you were talking about, Origen and then Jerome, when Jerome, hold on, I got it written down over here somewhere. Jerome, he when he finished the Vulgate, I think it was finished by I think it said 405 A.D. And he translated that Hallel as Lucifer, like you said. But when we get further along and we get into the Middle Ages, or even before that, but you get into the Middle Ages, Lucifer had become kind of synonymous with Satan. I mean, it had gotten to that point. But when you get to like John Calvin, which I'm definitely not a Calvinist, don't get me wrong, but John Calvin did not agree.
He knew you wouldn't be.
But John Calvin did not agree with that viewpoint either, right? He said the same thing, that he had a whole and John Calvin's commentary in Isaiah 14 said the exposition of this passage, talking about Isaiah 14, which some have given as if it referred to Satan, has arisen from ignorance. For the context plainly shows these statements must be understood in the reference to the king of the Babylonians, which, once again, that's debatable. But the passages of Scripture are taken up at random, and no attention is paid to the context. We need not wonder what mistakes of this kind frequently arise, yet it was an instance of very gross ignorance to imagine Lucifer was the king of devils, and the prophet gave him the name. But these inventions have no probability whatever. Let us pass them as useless fables. I mean, that's John Calvin. And then also, and I thought it was kind of interesting, Martin Luther. And, I was raised Lutheran, and Lutherans, it's very synonymous, the Satan to Lucifer connection. But when Luther brought this up, I was reading this. It was from a commentary by Franz Delzich, and it said that a quote from Lucifer. I said it again, Luther. It said, "Insignis error totius papatus," which meant a noteworthy error of the papacy when referring to that connection. And I thought that was rather amazing. When you have even, people like Martin Luther, growing up as a Lutheran, Martin Luther's on a little bit of a pedestal, right? You have him there, the 95 Theses and all these different things. But yet we still stick to the tradition that we're given when we look back at the from Origen and Tertullian and Jerome. We stick to these traditions, and I think that people like you make it such a important point that we need to dig into this stuff for ourselves, because what we're doing is we're looking at what man has told us. We're not looking at what God's told us, because we're jumping over certain things. We're making connections that other people have told us. We need to make sure that we're digging into this word ourselves, because the truth is there. But majority of Christians as a whole are very comfortable sitting back and listening to somebody else tell us this is what you should believe. And we sit back and we just say, oh, yep, then Lucifer, Satan, we're good with that.
Well, it's like that meme I posted, it showed Chris Farley, holding his beer up and making a face, and it shows the family sitting in front of the TV. Oh, I saw it on TV. My research is done.
Yeah. And that's about it. And I don't think, I think many people have the mistaken idea that you need to be a scholar to really dig in this deep and find these things. And that's really just not the case. I've been blessed that, my mother was a school teacher in her younger days. So she taught my sister and me to read very early. I was reading before I started kindergarten, and had a love of learning for a long time, which continues to this day. So that is, a true blessing. Not everybody has that desire or that gift. Just like, when it comes to doing anything that involves making anything with my hands more complicated than pounding a nail or turning a screw, forget it. I know where, a man's got to know his limitations. I hire somebody who knows what he's doing. But the tools that we have available to us So much of this information is available on the web. Most of what we get, Sharon and I, for our research is through sites like academia.edu. There are other sites similar to that where scholars post their papers, and for a nominal fee, or even for free in many cases, you can download a lot of these things. The Bible study tools at places like Blue Letter Bible or Bible Hub or others are just, I mean, just imagine what somebody like Spurgeon could have done with all of these electronic tools at his disposal. We don't have an excuse to not dig in. We've also got the benefit of modern archaeology that has found many texts that were not available to the scholars of centuries gone by. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Ugaritic texts from places like Ebla and Mari and Babylon and Nuzi and other places in the ancient Near East that help us to understand the world of the Bible more fully. And when you start putting all these pieces together, the picture is so much richer than what most of us have been taught. I mean, again, it's not just the devil and some little cartoon demons running around with pitchforks. It's a pantheon, a pagan pantheon that has set itself up as a rogue government here on earth temporarily. God, Jesus, called him, Satan that is, the prince of this world or the god of this world, but his dominion is temporary. God, Jesus, will come back and reclaim it. And this war that is going on around us, when you look at this and understand that these creatures that God himself in Scripture refers to as gods and giants and dragons are real, like we're in the middle of a Tolkien-esque war, except it's really happening, and we're in the middle of it. And I think if we teach our kids this stuff, and that these things are real, and that Jesus took it really seriously, I think they'll get a lot more excited about the Bible. I mean, again, the reason we're going to Israel early is to see some of the places that we've talked before about on this program. Jesus being baptized, not at Bethany across the Jordan, like John 1:28, but at Bashan across the Jordan. Why did he do that? Why did he go there? Well, look at all these megalithic sites, these monuments to the dead, these dolmens, Gilgal Rephaim. There's a similar site. It looks like Gilgal Rephaim, but about 1/3 the size. That's half a mile from Bethsaida, where Jesus called his first disciples, Philip, Nathaniel, Andrew, Peter. Hey, come with me. Half a mile away is this thing, concentric rings around a central tomb with a dolmen in the middle. You think they didn't know it was there? And that's where John was baptizing. It's like, and when he moved to Capernaum, which is in that region, Matthew says it was a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. The people dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. Like, the valley of the shadow of death is for real? Well, yeah. And that's where Jesus got baptized. And then he goes to Mount Hermon and says, oh yeah, on this rock, this 9,200-foot mountain here is where I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell, this really big cave over here, will not prevail against it. Why did he do that if it wasn't important? Why haven't we been taught that this stuff was important? That's what gets me fired up. And that's, like I said, that's why we want to go early, so we can shoot some video and hopefully convey this sense of excitement that we have about learning these things.
I love that video you done a few years back when you was standing there, man. You were fired up. You were in preacher mode. You said, who do you say that I am? He said, this was I think you referred to it as a flare gun fired off into the spirit realm.
The spirit realm,
Jesus was standing there saying, come and get some.
Yeah.
Loved it.
It was a blessing to be able to do that, because we had a group of about 100 people with us. And you could just hear when you say, on this rock I will build my church, and the people are standing there and just look up at the mountain, and it begins to dawn that Jesus took his disciples there specifically to make that point. I mean, it's not like they hopped in the car, drove for half an hour, and went there spur of the moment. It's 30 miles away from his home base at Capernaum. It's like a 2, maybe 3 day walk. You're walking, you're wearing sandals, you're climbing these hills and mountains, you're going through the Hula Valley, which at the time was a marsh, swampy, mosquitoes. it's not something you do spur of the moment just to. And he went there specifically. When you track the career of Jesus and the movements during his ministry, he had been over in what is now Lebanon, where he healed the daughter of the Syro-Phoenician woman. And then he went back to the Sea of Galilee, where he fed, the 4,000 plus their families. And then he went back to Caesarea Philippi. Now that road from Tyre runs right past Dan and Caesarea Philippi before cutting south toward the Sea of Galilee. He could have just said, hey, look, fellas, while we're in the neighborhood, let's go over here. He didn't. He took him 60 miles, down to the Sea of Galilee and then back again to make a specific point at that specific place. And that mountain, El, his Mount of Assembly, which was the mountain of the Transfiguration. It's the only very high mountain in the vicinity of Caesarea Philippi. In fact, Matthew only mentions a very high mountain twice in his gospel. The other time is when Satan takes him up the high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the earth.
I think it's the same mountain too.
Yeah,
and it says he took his 70 disciples. He sent out his 70. So basically he was saying, I put my 70 against your 70, and I'm going to reclaim my nations.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So Jesus took all of this very seriously. And then as he went back to Jerusalem, he spent, this blew me away. He spends the last week of his life dividing his time between the Temple Mount, obviously it's his father's house, and the Mount of Olives. Why the Mount of Olives? Go back 1,000 years, 900 years to the time of Solomon. Solomon built a high place there for Milcom. Milcom was the Ammonite form of the name Molech. Turns out that Milcom is just a name that means king. The actual chief god of the Ammonites was El, the creator god of the Canaanites. So El, Enlil, Molech, one and the same. Solomon builds a high place for Molech on the summit of the Mount of Olives. Now, why is that relevant? Because it's 200 feet higher than the Temple Mount, and it's east of the Temple Mount, meaning whenever they opened the doors of the temple, the priests would look out and look up and see this temple to Molech looking down on the temple of God. And so because of this, according to 2 Kings 23:13, the priests began calling it the Mount of Corruption. But again, we got that Hebrew definite article ha, meaning the in there. It's har ha mashkit, Mount of the Corruption. That doesn't make sense. English translators trying to understand it, try to make sense. They drop the word the out of the name. But when you look elsewhere in Scripture, and again, this is where the electronic toys come in handy. I'm glad I didn't live in the days of Spurgeon. It would drive me nuts. Exodus 12:23, the word ha mashkit, and in Jeremiah 51, ha mashkit means destroyer, the destroyer. It's the Mount of the Destroyer. Who's the destroyer in Revelation 9, Abaddon or Apollyon? And again, I argue that entity, the destroyer, is Shemiyaza from the book of 1 Enoch, the leader of the rebellion in Genesis 6. So in other words, this entity, Lucifer, actually refers to this entity who rebelled in Genesis 6, who gets out of the bottomless pit in Revelation 9, and in between has been convincing humanity for thousands of years to sacrifice our children to him. This is what is going on in Scripture. And I think this is why, perhaps, he is in the bottomless pit right now, in chains. Because if he'd been allowed to roam free during these long millennia, well, for whatever his reasons, God knew what would have happened, and he saw that it was necessary to put a stop to it.
Well, I'll tell you, Derek, you are just a phenomenal example of why we need to really, truly dig into the Bible, read everything, because nothing's in there by accident. So when we put these different locations, these different points, and that's the other part is the geography and the locations, all this stuff, it means something. And it's so important to look into that because it makes a difference in how you interpret these things and how you look at them, on top of the fact, like we said before, that you have to look at it through their eyes when you're looking at the religions and the powers of that time, and who was, the rival kingdom, who was their, quote unquote God at that time. All these things play a role in interpreting and deciphering the Bible, and it's up to us. And what was that? That's that verse always that we said at the beginning of the show, right? Is the it's the and the glory of kings to search things out. Exactly. And I just love that, and I think that you are such a good example of that. And I think that just listening to you and listening to one of these shows where you really dive into one of these topics should be such motivation for everybody to do the same on their own. And I think that's really, the focus of this show is to get people to start doing that on their own, really dig in, really take it to the next level, because, when you read your Bible, God's speaking to you. And when you listen to what God has to say, he's going to tell you something that you need to hear. He tells me something different than he tells Justin, than he tells Ben, than he tells you, Derek. He tells us something different, and we all need to listen. He's going to teach us through that, and it's just so important because nothing's in there by accident.
Well, see, you totally showed me something today. I mean, I ain't going to lie, I didn't reread the entire book, but that David Lowe book, every book I read, I always highlight and make notes in it and stuff like that. So I flipped through and wrote down my highlights and stuff like that. And I actually had something I was wanting to pitch at you, and you threw a little bit of a monkey wrench in it, but I'm glad you did. You taught me something. But I'm still going to ask you anyway, and then maybe with your interpretation to it, enlighten me some more. But when I was reading that book, it talked about, the Septuagint rendering that word as hierophos. I'm sorry, correct me, but I think
Hierophoros.
Yeah, hierophoros. But it said that it's a shining stellar body, a shining one. Then Halil. But it said that basically that the Greeks seen this star, this planet, Venus, not as one, but as two. So when the star shone itself before the sunrise, it was a whole different star, a whole different planet. Then when it showed itself, at the beginning of the night, it was totally different. So it was like in the Greeks, it was let me see here. The morning star was Eophoros, and then Phosphoros. So it was like talking about, there was basically a distinction between the two. The evening was the Hesperos, and then the morning was the Phosphoros.
Mm-hmm.
And so
that actually makes sense. That makes sense because the Canaanites had two different aspects of Venus. In the evening, it was Astarte, who was their version of Inanna or Ishtar. But in the morning, it was the war god Athtar. So male in the morning, female at night.
And so what you threw a wrench in to my little thing was, I was thinking, this, was representing of Satan, even though it's not the personal name, it's still, kind of referring to him and his fall. And then I got to thinking, well, later in Revelations, Jesus himself calls himself the Hesperos, the morning star. He's the true morning star. So, and we know that Satan tries to imitate. He wants to be like, but he can't. So this might be a very poor example, but it's the best one I can come up with. Like the yin and the yang. So where they seen this one planet as two, is this, kind of like an imitation. He can't be the morning star, so therefore he put up this deception. He's like the morning star. But then I also thought about Zechariah 3. Satan was at the right hand of the Father, accusing Joshua, the high priest. Right. Well, in Revelation, when it talks about, when Satan is thrown down, it specifically says, because there was no place for him. Because Jesus took his place at the right hand. So it was kind of like, I was thinking in my head, was Satan, like, technically the high priest? Because Jesus is now the eternal high priest, and it says he took his spot because there's no longer a place for him. But now you've kind of got me thinking, well, it's not Satan. So I guess with this new light, it's like it was this entity that is now in everlasting chains wants the high priest.
Well, and he may have been the high priest in heaven. And that may be why through his pride, he thought he could take this creation, earth, that God had given to the descendants of Adam and Eve. Told them to go forth, be fruitful and multiply, take dominion of the earth. According to Ezekiel 28:13, every precious stone was your covering. And when you read in the Septuagint, the stones, there are more stones. There are 12 exactly in the Septuagint. They're missing a couple in the Masoretic text, which is what our English Old Testaments are based on. But they match the stones in the ephod worn by the high priest, as it was described by God when he gave the instructions to Moses. So was Shemiyaza, Abaddon, Apollyon, was he the high priest in Eden? Could be. And again, was he a cherub? Well, possibly, if he's different from the being in the garden in Genesis 3, which is a Nakash, not a cherub. He could have been the anointed guardian cherub. Or if we take the Septuagint version, he was placed there with the anointed guardian cherub who had to throw him out because he rebelled. Either way, I think we're looking at an entity here that's different from Satan, because again, the Jews never connected, and we never see anything in the Old Testament connecting Satan or the Satan to the netherworld, to Sheol, to the Rephaim, whereas this entity, Shemiyaza, is connected to the Rephaim. He and his buddies are their parents. And because of that, according to Peter and Jude, and also what we see in the extra biblical texts like First Enoch, they were punished and basically chained up in the netherworld for that sin. So I think, and again, this is not a theological hill I'll die on, but I think the evidence fits the theory, and it just, again, reinforces the idea that this war we're in the middle of is a lot more convoluted, complicated, and more intense than we've been taught.
Well, in your opinion, why was all the sin ascribed to Azazel? So is he like the two beasts it talks about in Revelation? One's actually in charge, and the other one's just the mouthpiece. Was Azazel the mouthpiece, so to say?
Well, it's almost like there are two narratives in the book of First Enoch, and this is not an area where I'm an expert, but at least this is my understanding, that you've got the story of Shemiyaza, who was the chief of the Watchers, the one who led the rebellion. But then you've got the narrative connected to Azazel or Azael, who was responsible for teaching forbidden knowledge. So all of that stuff was ascribed to Azazel. He taught us incantations and root cutting and charms and witchcraft and sorcery and using makeup and for alluring and adornment and entrapping others, the art of making weapons and things like that. Forbidden knowledge, things we weren't supposed to know. Almost like Prometheus in the Greek myth. Prometheus, who stole fire from Olympus and gave it to humanity and was punished by being sent to Tartarus for it. That's kind of what Azazel did. It's a very similar story. In a way, it's also similar to the account of the Apkallu in Mesopotamia, who were believed to. It's believed that there were seven, and this is a pattern we see a lot in the ancient world. There are seven sages in many different cultures. There's seven supernatural wise men who bring the gifts of civilization to humanity. These seven Apkallu, according to a Mesopotamian text called the Epic of Era, E-R-R-A, who was a war god who kind of goes insane and starts laying waste to everything. In that text, the chief god or king of the gods, Marduk, who's taken over the top spot of the pantheon from Enlil, Marduk says he grew angry with the Apkallu, the craftsmen, and he sent them to the Abzu, the abyss, and told them never to return. So again, we get these similarities in the stories, which I don't think are coincidental. I think that the myths and religions of the pagans of the ancient world are just fake news versions of the history that's in the Bible.
Listen, you have no clue how much we appreciate you jumping on with us tonight, Derek. And every time I learn so much, every time we talk to you, whether it's in person or whether it's on one of these podcasts here. But Thank you so much for coming on. If you would like to give a little plug again to, where everybody can find your information, your books, where they can look up anything about you, go ahead.
No, happy to do it. You'll find all of our stuff at gilberthouse.org. I do the daily news analysis for Skywatch TV, and people can find that at skywatchtv.com. Or the Skywatch TV app, but gilberthouse.org is where all the stuff that Sharon and I do, our weekly program, Unraveling Revelation, our weekly Bible study, my weekly podcast, A View from the Bunker. Sharon and I have gone back and we started producing our podcast that started all of this back in 2005, PID Radio. All of that is on our free app, which is at gilberthouse.org/app. And so, yeah, that's sort of our global hub as we begin to roll out our plan of world domination.
Highly recommend the app. That's where I listen to a lot of your stuff, especially the Iron and Myth stuff. I absolutely adore. That stuff's awesome. Yes. Those guys, you guys together are amazing. So
yeah. We've had everybody but Brian. We need to get Brian on, and we'll complete the table.
Yep.
But thanks again.
Get him on. He's a great interview. Well, honored to do it. Happy to do it, and look forward. Anytime you guys want, just give me a holler.
Hey, we'll take you up on that now. Be sure and tell Miss Gilbert thank you for instilling the love of reading, because we are all direct beneficiaries.
Beneficiaries.
That will make her night. I will pass it on to her, Justin. I appreciate that.
All right, we'll see you, Derek. Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
God bless.
Thank you guys for tuning in. And just as you heard from the man, we have no excuse. Keep digging.
We thank you for listening to the Dig Bible Podcast. Questions, comments, or future episode ideas? We'd love to hear from you at the dig423@gmail.com. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to share, subscribe, and check out our Facebook group at the Dig Podcast. Remember, you can't lean on a shovel and pray for a hole. You gotta dig.